They whispered behind her back at Shaw Air Force Base. Corporate pilot, they called her. Probably learned everything from simulator games and weekend warrior training. Then she climbed into that beaten-up trainer jet they'd assigned her and executed a vertical knife-edge maneuver that left their squadron's top ace spinning in confusion. But when she pulled off her flight helmet in the debriefing room, revealing a small silver pin tucked beneath her civilian contractor badge, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes nearly dropped her coffee cup. Because that pin represented missions that were buried so deep in classified archives that most people didn't even know they existed. Want to know what that silver pin meant and why an entire squadron of elite fighter pilots suddenly couldn't meet her eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let's begin. The South Carolina heat hung over Shaw Air Force Base like a wet blanket soaked in diesel fuel and ambition. At 7:30 in the morning, the thermometer already kissed 85 degrees, promising another scorching day where the tarmac would shimmer like water and every piece of metal on the flight line would become untouchable by noon. The humidity wrapped around everything, turning the simplest task into an endurance test and making flight suits cling uncomfortably to skin that was already beginning to perspire. Hangar Delta-7 stood like a cathedral of aluminum and purpose. Its massive doors rolled open to catch whatever breeze might dare to stir in the stifling air. Inside, the 421st Fighter Training Squadron prepared for another day of molding the next generation of fighter pilots, their voices echoing off the cone off the Tiangding. Curved ceiling in a mixture of professional banter and good-natured rivalry. The smell of jet fuel mingled with hydraulic fluid and the ozone scent of electrical systems running diagnostics, creating an atmosphere that spoke of power barely contained and precision measured in microseconds. F-16 Fighting Falcons sat in neat rows like predatory birds waiting for the hunt, their bubble canopies reflecting the harsh, fluorescent lighting that fought against the natural gloom of the massive structure. Each aircraft bore the scars of intensive training, small dings and scratches that told stories of young pilots learning the difference between confidence and cockiness at velocities that left no room for error. The newest jets gleamed with recent maintenance, their paint schemes crisp and their avionics upgraded to the latest specifications. The older trainers sat slightly apart, workhorses that had seen thousands of flights and still performed flawlessly despite their age and the condescending attitudes of pilots who preferred newer equipment. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency. Between the aircraft, their choreographed dance of preparation involving fuel trucks, maintenance platforms, and weapons loading systems that could transform these sleek machines from training tools into instruments of lethal precision. The sound of pneumatic tools mixed with the distant whine of auxiliary power units and the occasional burst of radio chatter that kept the entire operation synchronized like a complex musical performance where every note mattered. Beyond the hangar's mouth, the flight line stretched toward runways that could handle anything from cargo transports to the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world's inventory. The control tower stood sentinel over it all, its windows reflecting the morning sun while air traffic controllers managed the careful ballet of military aviation with voices that remained calm even when dealing with emergencies that would terrify civilians. This was a place where routine training could shift to real-world deployment with a single phone call, where young men and women learned to master machines that cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a factor that affected everything from aircraft performance to human endurance. Pilots had to account for density altitude that robbed engines of power and wings of lift. Ground crews worked in shifts to prevent heat exhaustion. Even the asphalt seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in ways that could throw off the most careful maintenance schedules. This was environment as adversary, a constant reminder that flying demanded respect for forces far greater than human ambition. In squadron-ready room Charlie, coffee that had been brewing since before dawn sat in thermal carafes that were already half empty, the bitter liquid providing fuel for minds that would soon be calculating angles of attack and closure rates at speeds where hesitation could prove fatal. Mission boards covered one wall, displaying training scenarios that ranged from basic maneuvers to complex multi-aircraft exercises, designed to push pilots beyond their comfort zones and into the realm where instinct became more valuable than conscious thought. The morning briefing schedule was posted on a whiteboard that had seen countless erasures and updates, each line representing hours of flight time that would either build confidence or humble pride in news that no classroom instruction could achieve. Weather reports indicated clear skies with light winds, perfect conditions for the kind of training that separated those who could fly from those who belonged in the sky. Visibility unlimited, they called it, the kind of day when excuses evaporated faster than morning dew on hot metal. This was Shaw Air Force Base at its most typical, a place where excellence was expected rather than celebrated, where competence was the minimum standard and where the difference between good pilots and great ones was measured in fractions of seconds and degrees of precision that most people couldn't even perceive. It was into this environment of casual expertise and comfortable superiority that an outsider was about to step, carrying credentials that none of them would recognize, and skills that would challenge everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be a pilot. The 421st Fighter Training Squadron had built its reputation on producing pilots who went on to fly the most advanced aircraft in the world's most powerful air force. Their motto, "Strike fast, strike true," was more than words painted on a hangar wall. It was a philosophy that demanded precision, speed, and the kind of aggressive confidence that could turn split-second decisions into victories or disasters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They had won the inter-base competition 3 years running, a streak that had given them the comfortable assumption that they represented the pinnacle of military aviation training. But comfort, as they were about to learn, could be a dangerous thing. Excellence that went unchallenged could calcify into arrogance. Assumptions that went unexamined could blind even the most skilled professionals to truths that stood right in front of them. And sometimes the most important lessons came not from instructors or textbooks, but from quiet strangers who carried their expertise so lightly that it was almost invisible until the moment when it mattered most. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another day of routine training that would be anything but routine. In a few minutes, a silver civilian transport van would pull up to the main gate, carrying someone whose presence would transform the 421st Fighter Training Squadron's understanding of what it meant to be truly exceptional. The heat would continue to build, the aircraft would continue their mechanical preparations, and the pilots would continue their casual assumptions about civilian contractors and corporate pilots. But by the time the sun reached its zenith, everything they thought they knew about competence, respect, and the quiet professionals who moved among them would be forever changed. The South Carolina heat would still be oppressive, the F-16s would still be magnificent machines of war, and Shaw Air Force Base would still be a place where excellence was forged in the crucible of intensive training. But the 421st Fighter Training Squadron would never again be quite so confident about their ability to judge a pilot by their appearance, their equipment, or their civilian credentials. The stage was set for a lesson in humility that would be delivered at supersonic speeds and written in the contrails of aircraft pushed beyond their normal limits by someone whose true capabilities were about to shatter every assumption that comfort and success had allowed to take root. The silver civilian transport van pulled through the main gate of Shaw, Air Force Base with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and no particular desire to call attention to themselves. Behind the wheel sat Jessica Martinez, though the temporary visitor's badge clipped to her civilian flight suit simply read J. Martinez Contractor. The photograph on the badge showed a woman with longer hair and fewer lines around her eyes, taken during a time when anonymity hadn't been quite so important to her daily survival. Jessica wore the kind of civilian flight gear that immediately marked her as an outsider in this world of military precision and standardized equipment. Her flight suit was a commercial model, the kind sold to corporate pilots and civilian aviators who flew executives between cities in comfortable jets that never saw combat and rarely pushed beyond the comfortable margins of normal operations. The fabric was softer than military issue, designed for comfort rather than durability under extreme conditions. Her patches were minimal and generic, bearing only her name and basic certifications that suggested competence without indicating any particular distinction or specialized training. Her flight boots were civilian issue as well, expensive, but obviously purchased rather than earned through military service. They lacked the scuffs and wear patterns that came from years of military flying, where pilots learned to respect their equipment because their lives depended on it functioning perfectly under conditions that would ground civilian aircraft indefinitely. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who had learned to fly in comfortable circumstances, possibly starting with private lessons at a suburban airport, where the biggest challenges were weekend traffic patterns and occasional crosswinds. The temporary clearance badge swayed slightly as she walked, its laminated surface catching the harsh morning sunlight in a way that emphasized its outsider status. Temporary badges were common enough on military installations issued to contractors, vendors, and visitors who needed access for specific purposes, but weren't considered part of the permanent community. They marked their wearers as people who would be gone soon, who didn't quite belong, who needed to be watched and managed rather than trusted with the casual access that came with permanent credentials. Jessica moved across the parking lot with a gait that seemed almost deliberately unremarkable, the kind of studied normalcy that allowed her to blend into crowds and avoid the attention that had once been professionally dangerous. Her pace was neither hurried nor slow, her posture neither military erect nor civilian slouched, finding that middle ground that made her forgettable to casual observers. But there were small details that a trained eye might notice, the way she automatically cataloged exit routes, the unconscious tracking of potential threats, the subtle positioning that kept her back protected and her options open. Her gear bag was compact and professional, made of high-quality materials but without any of the military specifications or contractor markings that might have suggested serious aviation experience. It looked like something purchased from a catalog by someone who wanted to appear professional, without actually needing the durability that came from real operational use. The bag's contents were carefully selected to maintain her cover as a corporate pilot seeking recertification, containing only the basic equipment that such a pilot would be expected to carry. Inside the bag lay items that told a carefully constructed story. Civilian logbooks with entries documenting flights between major cities, insurance cards for aircraft she'd never actually owned, and certification documents that were genuine, but incomplete, showing only what a background check would reveal without delving into the classified portions of her record that were buried so deep that most investigators would never know to look for them. Her personal flight computer was a civilian model, loaded with navigation software appropriate for someone who flew predetermined routes between known airports rather than navigating by terrain features and tactical considerations. The morning heat was already beginning to take its toll on anyone wearing full flight gear, but Jessica showed none of the discomfort that might be expected from someone unaccustomed to operating in challenging environmental conditions. Her breathing remained steady, her movements economical, suggesting a tolerance for discomfort that came from experience with far worse conditions then a hot morning in South Carolina. But this too was subtle enough that casual observers would likely attribute it to good physical conditioning rather than specialized training. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that was difficult to categorize, neither the aggressive swagger that often marked military pilots nor the nervous energy of civilian aviators operating outside their comfort zones. There was something measured about her movements, as if she had learned to conserve energy for when it would be truly needed, as if efficiency had become so ingrained that it operated below the level of conscious thought. This was the bearing of someone who had learned that survival often depended on not standing out, on being underestimated rather than feared. Her eyes moved constantly but casually, taking in details of base security, aircraft positioning, and personnel movement, patterns with the kind of automatic assessment that became second nature to people who had operated in environments where such information could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But the movement was so natural, so integrated into her normal behavior, that it appeared to be nothing more than the curiosity of a visitor seeing a military installation for the first time. The contrast between her appearance and her underlying competence was carefully maintained through years of practice. Every detail of her civilian contractor persona had been selected to create specific impressions while concealing the truth that lay beneath. Her hair was longer than military regulations would allow, styled in a way that suggested someone who had never needed to fit it under a helmet during combat operations. Her hands showed calluses, but in the wrong places for someone who's flying. Experience was limited to corporate aviation, though the differences were subtle enough that only another pilot with similar experience would notice. As she approached the squadron area, Jessica Martinez presented exactly the image she intended: a civilian contractor of adequate but unremarkable competence, someone who needed recertification to maintain her commercial flying credentials, possibly someone whose best flying days were behind her. She looked like someone who might struggle with military aircraft and procedures, who would require patience and basic instruction to complete whatever minimal requirements had brought her to Shaw Air Force Base. The carefully constructed facade was complete, from her civilian flight gear to her temporary credentials to her studied air of mild uncertainty about military procedures. Everything about her appearance suggested that the 421st Fighter Training Squadron was about to deal with another routine recertification flight, another civilian pilot going through the motions required to maintain credentials that she probably used for uninspiring flights between predictable destinations. What none of them could see, what the carefully constructed cover story was designed to hide, was that Jessica Martinez had once been someone entirely different. Someone whose real name appeared on documents that were classified far above the clearance levels of the pilots who were about to judge her. Someone who had flown aircraft that officially didn't exist on missions that never happened, whose skills had been honed in environments where the margin for error was measured in microseconds, and where failure meant consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. But all of that was invisible beneath the surface of a middle-aged civilian contractor walking across a parking lot in the South Carolina heat, carrying gear that suggested modest competence and displaying none of the aggressive confidence that marked military aviators. She was exactly what she appeared to be, until the moment when she wasn't. Part 3. Opposition Setup inside Hangar Delta-7. Major Ryan Stevens stood like a monument to military aviation excellence, his flight suit bearing the patches and decorations that told the story of 15 years spent mastering the art of aerial warfare. His squadron patch showed a stylized hawk in diving attack position, surrounded by text that proclaimed the 421st Fighter Training Squadron's motto with the kind of pride that came from consistently proving their superiority over lesser units. His name tape read Hawk, the calsign he'd earned through aggressive flying and a talent for aerial combat that had made him the squadron's acknowledged ace. Stevens had built his reputation on precision flying and tactical superiority that consistently put him at the top of every training exercise and competition. His record included multiple commendations for excellence, instructor ratings that qualified him to teach the military's most advanced fighter tactics, and a combat record that included actual operational experience in theaters where the difference between good pilots and dead pilots was measured in split-second decision, making under conditions that would overwhelm most people's ability to function. At 38, he was reaching the peak of his flying career, old enough to have accumulated the experience that separated competent pilots from truly exceptional ones, but still young enough to maintain the physical and mental sharpness that aerial combat demanded. His reflexes had been tested against the best pilots in the Air Force, and he had consistently emerged victorious from exercises that simulated everything from basic dogfighting to complex, multi-threat scenarios that required tactical thinking, several moves ahead of the immediate situation. The problem was that Stevens had become comfortable with his superiority, accustomed to being the best pilot in any room he entered, and inclined to judge other aviators by standards that few could meet. His success had bred a certain arrogance that wasn't necessarily malicious, but was definitely limiting in its assumptions about who could and couldn't fly at his level. He had developed the habit of categorizing pilots quickly, sorting them into those worthy of his respect and those who existed primarily to make him look good by comparison. Standing beside him, Captain Amy Wilson wore her own reputation with the confident bearing of someone who had earned her place among the squadron's elite through flying that consistently exceeded expectations. Her callsign VIPER reflected both her tactical aggressiveness and her ability to strike with precision when opportunities presented themselves. Wilson had come up through the ranks alongside Stevens, sharing his experiences and adopting his attitudes about civilian aviators and the assumed inferiority of anyone who hadn't proven themselves in military aviation. Wilson's background included flight instructor certifications and combat experience that made her one of the most qualified pilots on the base. But her excellence had also contributed to a worldview that divided aviators into categories based on their military credentials and demonstrated performance under pressure. She had little patience for civilian pilots who thought that flying corporate jets qualified them to understand military aviation, and even less tolerance for contractors who seemed to believe that basic competence was equivalent to true expertise. Lieutenant Tom Cooper represented the newest generation of military aviators, fresh from advanced flight training and eager to prove himself worthy of flying alongside legends like Stevens and Wilson. His callsign BUZZ reflected both his enthusiasm and his tendency to push aircraft and himself to their limits in pursuit of the kind of aggressive excellence that would earn him acceptance among the squadron's established pilots. Cooper was talented enough to have graduated at the top of his flight training class, but inexperienced enough to believe that his recent achievements made him qualified to judge the competence of others. Cooper's youth brought energy and ambition to the squadron, but it also brought the kind of confident ignorance that could mistake surface appearances for underlying reality. He had learned to fly in an environment where everyone was held to the highest standards, where failure meant washing out of programs that represented the culmination of lifelong dreams, and where success was measured against other exceptional individuals rather than normal people. This background had given him an accurate understanding of what military aviation demanded, but it had also created blind spots about what competence could look like in other contexts. The three pilots had developed a comfortable dynamic based on their shared excellence and their collective assumption that military aviation represented the pinnacle of flying competence. They had worked together long enough to develop an almost telepathic understanding during complex training exercises, where split-second coordination could mean the difference between mission success and failure. Their professional relationships were built on mutual respect, earned through demonstrated excellence under conditions that would challenge the best pilots in the world. But this same closeness had also created an insular perspective that reinforced their assumptions about civilian aviators and contractor pilots. They had developed a routine of casual mockery directed at anyone who didn't meet their exacting standards, a form of professional hazing that they justified as maintaining the high standards that kept military aviation safe and effective. Their humor was often cruel, but it was also casual enough that they rarely considered its impact on the targets of their attention. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the ground crew chief responsible for aircraft maintenance and preparation, had adopted the attitudes of the pilots he served, despite his own background being firmly grounded rather than airborne. Rodriguez took pride in maintaining aircraft that performed flawlessly under the most demanding conditions, and he had developed strong opinions about which pilots deserved to fly the machines he spent countless hours perfecting. His expertise was genuine and valuable, but it was also limited to the mechanical aspects of aviation rather than the full scope of what it meant to be a pilot. Rodriguez had been at Shaw Air Force Base long enough to see countless civilian contractors come and go, most of them requiring basic instruction and patient guidance to complete whatever minimal requirements had brought them to military facilities. His experience had reinforced his belief that civilian pilots were essentially amateurs playing at a profession that required military discipline and training to truly master. He enjoyed the camaraderie that came from sharing the squadron's assumptions about civilian incompetence, and he particularly enjoyed the opportunity to demonstrate his superior knowledge to people he perceived as outsiders. The squadron's culture had evolved over years of consistent success and mutual reinforcement of shared attitudes about excellence and competence. They had created an environment where belonging required not just flying skill but also adherence to certain assumptions about who could and couldn't measure up to their standards. Their routine included casual dismissal of anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of what a real pilot looked like, and they had become comfortable with their ability to judge competence based on surface appearances and preliminary impressions. This wasn't necessarily malicious behavior, but it was definitely limiting in its scope and accuracy. The squadron had become so accustomed to their own excellence that they had lost the ability to recognize competence that didn't announce itself according to their expectations. They had developed blind spots about what expertise could look like when it was carried quietly, when it was hidden beneath surface appearances that didn't conform to their assumptions about how truly exceptional pilots should present themselves. Their morning routine included evaluating whoever had been assigned to their care, making predictions about performance based on quick visual assessments, and establishing betting pools that reflected their confidence in their ability to spot weakness and inexperience from across a hangar. They had turned their superior knowledge into a form of entertainment, a way of reinforcing their own status while highlighting the inadequacies of others. None of them considered the possibility that their judgment might be flawed, that their assumptions might be wrong, or that true expertise might sometimes disguise itself as ordinary competence for reasons they couldn't imagine. They were about to encounter someone whose presence would challenge everything they thought they knew about flying, about competence, and about the quiet professionals who moved among them carrying capabilities that were invisible until the moment when they mattered most. Part 4. Conflict Escalation, the morning briefing in Squadron Ready Room. Charlie began with the kind of routine announcements that marked every training day at Shaw Air Force Base, but it quickly shifted to focus on the unusual addition to their schedule. Major Stevens stood at the front of the room beside a whiteboard that displayed the day's flight assignments, his expression mixing professional responsibility with barely concealed amusement at what he clearly considered an unwelcome distraction from serious training activities. "Gentlemen and ladies," Stevens announced to the assembled pilots, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of leading successful training exercises and combat missions. "We have a special guest today. Civilian contractor needs some stick time to maintain her commercial ratings. Apparently the corporate flying world requires periodic demonstration that their pilots can handle real aircraft rather than the automated buses they usually drive between executive airports. The comment drew the expected chuckles from pilots who had spent years learning to hand-fly sophisticated military aircraft under conditions that would challenge the most advanced autopilot systems. Corporate aviation, in their experience, meant flying predetermined routes between well-maintained airports, using aircraft equipped with every possible automation aid, requiring pilots to do little more than monitor systems and follow air traffic. Control instructions that kept them safely separated from any real challenges. Captain Wilson leaned back in her chair with the confident relaxation of someone who had never doubted her ability to handle whatever challenges the day might bring. "What's her background?" she asked, though her tone suggested that she already knew the answer wouldn't be particularly impressive by their standards. "How much time does she actually have in military aircraft?" Stevens consulted the paperwork that had accompanied Jessica's assignment to their squadron, reading from documents that contained only the sanitized version of her flying history. "Says here she's got commercial ratings for multi-engine aircraft, instrument flight rules certification, and some basic aerobatic training. Looks like mostly corporate work, probably flying business executives who think turbulence is a major emergency and want their pilots to avoid anything more challenging." Then light chop. Lieutenant Cooper spoke up from his position near the back of the room, his youth evident in the eagerness with which he joined the conversation about civilian aviation competence. "How many hours total time?" he asked, though his question was clearly more about establishing the extent of her inexperience than about genuine curiosity regarding her qualifications. "Enough to get her licenses, apparently," Stevens replied with the kind of dismissive tone that suggested the specific number was less important than the fact that civilian flying hours couldn't compare to military training regardless of the totals involved. "But you know how civilian logbooks work. Half the time is probably straight and level cruise flight with the autopilot engaged. Not exactly what I'd call real flying experience." The pilots nodded in agreement, sharing the comfortable assumption that military aviation represented a fundamentally different level of challenge than anything civilian pilots encountered in their careers. Their training had included high-G maneuvering, tactical formation flying, aerial combat simulation, and emergency procedures that were designed to prepare them for conditions where civilian aircraft would simply be grounded indefinitely. They had earned their confidence through demonstrated competence under conditions that pushed both aircraft and pilots to their absolute limits. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined the conversation from his position near the maintenance status board, where he tracked the readiness of every aircraft in the squadron with the meticulous attention to detail that kept military aviation safe and effective. "Which bird are we giving her?" he asked, though his tone suggested that he already knew the answer and wasn't particularly happy about the assignment of valuable aircraft to what he considered routine civilian training. "Tail number 847, Stevens replied, referring to one of the older F-16 trainers that the squadron maintained for exactly these kinds of situations. Single-seat trainer variant, older avionics. Nothing too challenging for someone who's probably never pulled more than 2 Gs in her entire career. We don't want to overwhelm her with modern systems she wouldn't understand anyway." Aircraft 847 was indeed one of the squadron's older trainers, a reliable but decidedly unglamorous machine that had been used for countless hours of basic training flights. Its avionics were functional but dated. Its paint scheme showed the wear patterns of intensive use, and its overall condition reflected years of service training pilots who were still learning the fundamentals of military aviation. It was exactly the kind of aircraft that experienced pilots used for routine proficiency flights and basic certification requirements. The assignment represented more than just practical considerations about aircraft allocation. It was a subtle form of professional judgment, a way of communicating that civilian contractors deserved adequate equipment, but nothing approaching the advanced capabilities that real military pilots expected to use. The older trainer would provide everything necessary for basic flight requirements, while making it clear that the squadron didn't consider this particular pilot worthy of their more advanced aircraft. Captain Wilson stood and walked to the scheduling board, where she examined the planned flight profile with the kind of critical attention that suggested she was looking for ways to make the training appropriately challenging without being unreasonably difficult. Basic fighter maneuvers, she announced, reading from the standardized curriculum that covered fundamental aerial combat techniques, air-to-air training, defensive positioning, energy management. Nothing too advanced, but enough to see what she's actually capable of when she can't rely on autopilot and air traffic control to do the thinking for her. The training profile was indeed basic by military standards, designed to evaluate fundamental flying skills and tactical understanding, rather than advanced combat techniques that required years of specialized training to master. It would test the pilot's ability to maintain aircraft control under moderate G-forces, perform coordinated maneuvers that required spatial awareness and timing, and demonstrate understanding of energy management principles that were crucial to aerial combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Cooper grinned with the enthusiasm of someone who had recently mastered these same maneuvers and was eager to see how civilian training compared to military instruction. $20 says she taps out after the first vertical maneuver, he announced, establishing the kind of betting pool that had become routine whenever the squadron dealt with civilian pilots. Corporate flying doesn't exactly prepare you for pulling G's and maintaining situational awareness when the horizon starts spinning. "I'll take that bet," Rodriguez replied from his position near the maintenance board, "but I'm saying she doesn't even make it through the pre-flight inspection." Without asking for help, civilian pilots are used to having ground crews do everything for them. She probably doesn't even know how to properly check hydraulic fluid levels or interpret engine diagnostic readings. The betting quickly expanded to include predictions about everything from her radio procedures to her ability to maintain formation position during basic tactical exercises. The pilots and ground crew had turned their professional assessment into entertainment, a way of reinforcing their own expertise, while highlighting what they assumed would be obvious deficiencies in civilian flying competence. Stevens watched the developing pool with amusement that reflected his confidence in the outcome and his comfort with the squadron's tradition of evaluating outsiders through the lens of their own superior training and experience. "Just remember," he cautioned with mock seriousness, "we want her to complete the flight safely and meet whatever minimal requirements brought her here. Professional courtesy and all that. Save the real flying demonstrations for after she's gone." The comment revealed the extent to which they had already written off any possibility that their civilian visitor might surprise them with actual competence. Their assumption was that the morning would involve patient instruction and careful supervision designed to help an adequate but unremarkable pilot complete routine certification requirements. They expected to demonstrate their superior knowledge and skill through gentle guidance rather than being challenged by anything approaching their own level of expertise. As the briefing concluded and the pilots began preparing for their individual flight assignments, the comfortable assumption that guided their planning was that they were about to deal with another routine training evolution involving someone whose presence was required by administrative necessity rather than operational value. They had mentally categorized their visitor as someone who would require help, patience, and the kind of basic instruction that reminded them of their own superiority while providing minimal challenge to their established routines. None of them considered the possibility that their assumptions might be wrong, that their judgment might be flawed, or that the quiet woman in civilian flight gear might represent something entirely different from what they expected. They were about to encounter someone whose true capabilities would challenge everything they thought they knew about competence, excellence, and the quiet professionals who moved among them carrying expertise that was invisible until the moment when it was most needed. Part 5, Preparation Revelation. Jessica Martinez approached the aircraft assignment board with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it would be truly needed. Her civilian flight gear marking her as an outsider in this environment of military precision and standardized equipment. The board showed her assigned to tail number 847, one of the older F-16A trainers that occupied the less prestigious positions in the hangar lineup. She studied the assignment without any visible reaction, though her eyes lingered on the aircraft's specifications with the kind of attention that suggested more than casual interest in the details. The F-16A assigned to her was indeed one of the squadron's workhorses, an aircraft that had logged thousands of training hours and bore the subtle signs of intensive use that marked machines dedicated to instruction rather than frontline operations. Its paint scheme was regulation but faded. Its surfaces showed the wear patterns of countless student pilots learning to master military aviation, and its overall condition reflected functional adequacy rather than the pristine maintenance standards applied to newer aircraft reserved for advanced training and operational missions. But as Jessica began her pre-flight inspection, something shifted in her demeanor that would have been visible to anyone watching carefully enough to notice the change. Her movements became more purposeful, more systematic, following a pattern that spoke of procedures learned through repetition under conditions where mistakes carried consequences far more serious than training failures. She moved around the aircraft with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before, her hands finding inspection points with muscle memory precision that suggested familiarity extending far beyond basic commercial aviation requirements. Her inspection began with the aircraft's exterior surfaces, but not in the cursory manner that civilian pilots often employed when dealing with unfamiliar military equipment. Instead, she conducted a methodical examination that covered every critical system and component with the thoroughness of someone who understood that aircraft maintenance in combat environments required personal verification of every detail that could affect flight safety and mission success. Her hands moved over control surfaces, checking for proper movement and mechanical integrity with the practiced touch of someone who had learned to trust her own assessment over written maintenance logs. She examined the engine intake with particular attention, running her fingers along the edges to check for damage or foreign object contamination that could cause catastrophic failure during high-performance operations. Her inspection included areas that civilian pilots rarely bothered to examine personally, components that were normally trusted to ground crew maintenance, but which combat pilots learned to verify for themselves because their lives depended on equipment functioning perfectly under extreme conditions. Her flight gear, while civilian in appearance, began to reveal subtle differences that suggested more than casual aviation experience. Her helmet, though lacking military markings, bore the signs of extensive use and showed modifications that were common among pilots who flew challenging missions requiring enhanced communication capabilities and protection under harsh conditions. Her survival vest, while not military issue, contained equipment that went well beyond the basic safety requirements of civilian aviation, including items that suggested familiarity with operations in hostile environments where standard emergency procedures might not be sufficient. Most significantly, she carried personal flight equipment that told a story of experience that extended far beyond corporate aviation. Her kneeboard contained navigation aids and reference materials that were oriented toward tactical flying rather than instrument procedures between known airports. Her personal GPS unit was programmed with waypoints and routes that suggested familiarity with military training areas and restricted airspace that civilian pilots rarely encountered. Even her flight computer contained software and databases that were more sophisticated than what most civilian aviators required for their routine operations. As she continued her pre-flight inspection, Jessica's hands moved with the kind of unconscious competence that comes from thousands of hours of experience with high-performance aircraft operated under demanding conditions. She checked hydraulic, Systems with the thoroughness of someone who understood that failure at altitude could mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic disaster. Her examination of the aircraft's weapons pylons, though they carried only training equipment, showed familiarity with military systems that went well beyond the basic knowledge that civilian pilots might acquire through casual exposure. Her cockpit preparation followed patterns that were invisible to casual observers, but which revealed training that extended far beyond commercial aviation requirements. She adjusted seat and control positions with the precision of someone who had learned that comfort was secondary to tactical effectiveness, that pilot position could affect everything from G-force tolerance to target acquisition speed during aerial combat operations. Her arrangement of equipment and references followed protocols designed for maximum efficiency under high-stress conditions, where every second could determine mission success or failure. The squadron's ground crew chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, watched her preparation with growing puzzlement that reflected his experience with hundreds of civilian pilots who had used squadron aircraft for routine training and certification flights. Most civilian contractors required basic instruction about military aircraft systems, guidance about proper procedures, and patient explanation of differences between civilian and military aviation practices. But Jessica's preparation suggested familiarity that went well beyond what her paperwork indicated, competence that seemed inconsistent with her supposed background in corporate aviation. "Ma'am," Rodriguez finally asked, his professional curiosity overcoming his initial assumptions about civilian pilot competence, "have you flown military aircraft before? You seem pretty familiar with the systems for someone who's supposed to be civilian." Jessica's response was carefully neutral, designed to acknowledge his observation without revealing information that could compromise the cover story that had brought her to Shaw Air Force Base. "I've had some exposure to military systems," she replied, her tone suggesting experience without providing specifics that might invite additional questions. Basic familiarity with tactical aircraft operations, nothing too advanced. Her answer was technically accurate while being completely misleading about the actual extent of her background. She had indeed been exposed to military aircraft systems, but that exposure had included flying aircraft that were so classified that most military pilots didn't know they existed, operating under conditions that pushed both equipment and human capabilities to their absolute limits, and completing missions that had required skills far beyond what conventional military training provided. But Rodriguez's trained eye continued to notice details that didn't match his expectations for civilian pilot competence. Her fuel quantity calculations included factors that civilian pilots rarely considered, adjustments for weight and balance. That accounted for tactical maneuvering rather than normal flight operations. Her radio frequency selection showed familiarity with military communication protocols that went beyond the basic knowledge that civilian contractors typically acquired through minimal briefings. Most tellingly, her personal equipment included items that were simply unavailable to civilian pilots, tools and references that could only be obtained through specialized military channels or developed through operational experience that her official background didn't support. Her flight planning materials included tactical considerations and threat assessments that were irrelevant to civilian aviation but crucial for military operations in contested environments. As she completed her pre-flight inspection and began final preparations for engine start, Jessica Martinez presented a contradiction that challenged every assumption the squadron had made about civilian pilot competence. Her surface appearance continued to suggest adequate but unremarkable flying experience, someone who needed basic military aircraft familiarization to complete routine certification requirements. But her actual preparation revealed knowledge and capabilities that extended far beyond what her cover story could explain. The careful observer might have noticed that her movements around the aircraft followed tactical considerations rather than simple efficiency, that her positioning maintained awareness of potential threats even in the controlled environment of a military base, that her equipment selection reflected priorities that were more consistent with combat operations than training flights. But these details were subtle enough that they required specialized knowledge to recognize and interpret correctly. What was becoming clear to anyone watching carefully was that Jessica Martinez was not the civilian contractor she appeared to be, that her preparation revealed capabilities that extended far beyond corporate aviation, and that the 421st Fighter Training Squadron was about to encounter someone whose true background would challenge everything they thought they knew about competence, expertise, and the quiet professionals who moved among them carrying skills that were invisible until the moment when they mattered most. The stage was set for a demonstration that would transform their understanding of what it meant to be truly exceptional, delivered by someone who had learned to hide her capabilities so effectively that even experienced military aviators couldn't recognize what was standing right in front of them. The F-16 Ace engine spun to life with the characteristic whine that marked the beginning of every flight, its turbofan creating the familiar vibration that traveled through the airframe and into the pilot's seat like a mechanical heartbeat. Jessica Martinez completed her engine start checklist with methodical precision, each action flowing into the next with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions under conditions where mistakes could prove fatal. The aircraft systems came online in sequence, hydraulics building pressure, electrical systems stabilizing, and avionics initializing with the digital precision that made modern military aviation possible. From the tower's perspective, her taxi procedures appeared entirely routine, following standard ground movement protocols with the careful attention to clearances and traffic patterns that marked competent but unremarkable piloting. She maintained proper spacing behind other aircraft, acknowledged radio transmissions with standard phraseology, and proceeded to the active runway with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that ground operations required patience and precision rather than aggressive maneuvering that could endanger other aircraft or personnel. Major Stevens launched first in his newer F-16C, the more advanced aircraft accelerating down the runway with the aggressive power application that characterized his flying style. His takeoff was textbook perfect, demonstrating the kind of precise control that had made him the squadron's acknowledged leader and earned him respect throughout the fighter pilot community. The newer aircraft's enhanced avionics and improved engine performance were evident in the smooth acceleration and clean departure that marked every aspect of his professional competence. Jessica followed 2 minutes later, her older trainer requiring slightly more attention to engine parameters and flight control inputs that weren't quite as refined as the newer variants. Her takeoff was smooth and professional, demonstrating adequate competence with military aircraft while showing none of the aggressive confidence that marked truly exceptional pilots. To observers on the ground, her departure appeared entirely routine, the kind of careful flying that civilian contractors used to avoid embarrassing themselves while completing required training evolutions. The initial rendezvous took place at 15,000 feet over the designated training area, a section of airspace reserved for military training operations and cleared of civilian traffic that might be endangered by the high-speed maneuvering that characterized fighter pilot instruction. Stevens established the standard tactical formation, positioning his aircraft to provide both instructor oversight and tactical realism that would test basic fighter pilot skills without overwhelming someone whose experience was presumably limited to civilian aviation procedures. Ghost 4, Hawk 1. Stevens transmitted using the call sign that had been assigned to Jessica for the training flight, his voice carrying the professional authority that marked military aviation communications. We'll start with basic fighter maneuvers. Follow my lead, maintain visual contact, and don't try anything beyond your comfort zone. This is about demonstrating basic competence, not winning any contests. Jessica's response was brief and professional. acknowledging the instructions with standard radio procedures that revealed familiarity with military communication protocols without suggesting anything exceptional about her background or capabilities. Ghost 4 copies, ready to commence training evolution. The first maneuver Stevens demonstrated was a basic barrel roll, a fundamental aerobatic technique that tested spatial orientation and aircraft control while introducing moderate G-forces that could challenge pilots unaccustomed to tactical flying. His execution was flawless, demonstrating the kind of smooth control inputs and precise timing that characterized professional military aviation. The maneuver was designed to be challenging enough to reveal competence levels while remaining within the capabilities of adequately trained civilian pilots. Jessica followed him through the maneuver with careful precision, her aircraft tracking his movements with the kind of steady control that suggested basic aerobatic training and reasonable familiarity with moderate G-force environments. Her execution was competent rather than impressive, demonstrating adequate skills while avoiding any display of exceptional capability that might draw unwanted attention to her true background. To Stevens, her performance appeared entirely consistent with a civilian contractor who had received basic aerobatic instruction and was comfortable with routine tactical maneuvers. The second evolution involved a simple tactical turn, a coordinated maneuver that required maintaining formation position while executing a coordinated direction change under moderate G loading. Stevens applied approximately 3 Gs during the turn, enough to test basic G tolerance and aircraft handling skills without exceeding what civilian pilots might encounter during aerobatic training or unusual attitude recovery procedures. Jessica's performance during this maneuver began to reveal subtle hints of capabilities that extended beyond basic civilian training. Her aircraft maintained perfect position relative to Stevens throughout the turn, demonstrating spatial awareness and control precision that was more consistent with advanced tactical training than basic aerobatic instruction. Her radio transmissions remained calm and professional, showing none of the strain that civilian pilots often experienced when dealing with unfamiliar G-forces and complex maneuvering requirements. Most significantly, her energy management during the turn demonstrated understanding of tactical flying principles that were rarely taught in civilian aviation training. She maintained optimum airspeed and altitude relationships throughout the maneuver, positioning her aircraft to maintain tactical advantage while executing the required demonstration. These details were subtle enough that Stevens didn't immediately recognize their significance, but they revealed knowledge that extended well beyond what her supposed background could explain. The third maneuver involved a vertical climb to test engine performance and pilot technique under conditions that pushed both aircraft and pilot toward their operational limits. Stevens pulled his aircraft into a steep climb that required careful throttle management and precise control inputs to maintain stability, while fighting against gravity and aerodynamic forces that could quickly overwhelm inexperienced pilots. Jessica followed him through the vertical maneuver with control precision that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as simple civilian competence. Her aircraft tracked his movements exactly, maintaining formation position throughout the climb while demonstrating throttle control and energy management that suggested familiarity with high-performance aircraft operations under demanding conditions. Her technique was so smooth that it appeared effortless, though achieving such precision required skills that were normally developed through extensive military training. As they reached the top of the climb and prepared to transition into the next phase of training, Stevens found himself beginning to question his initial assumptions about Jessica's background and capabilities. Her performance was exceeding his expectations for civilian pilot competence, demonstrating skills that seemed inconsistent with corporate aviation experience. But her radio transmissions continued to suggest adequate rather than exceptional capability, and her aircraft assignment to the older trainer reinforced the assumption that she represented routine rather than extraordinary competence. The fourth Evolution involved a simulated defensive break, a tactical maneuver designed to defeat incoming threats through aggressive maneuvering that combined speed, altitude changes, and direction reversals to confuse enemy targeting systems. Stevens executed the maneuver with the kind of violent precision that characterized real aerial combat, pulling G-forces that approached the limits of human tolerance while maintaining aircraft control under conditions that would overwhelm most civilian pilots. Jessica's execution of the defensive break revealed capabilities that could no longer be dismissed as civilian contractor competence. Her aircraft performed the maneuver with precision that matched Stevens' demonstration, pulling equivalent G-forces while maintaining control authority and situational awareness that was consistent with advanced tactical training. Her recovery from the maneuver was flawless, positioning her aircraft optimally for follow-on tactical actions, while demonstrating understanding of energy relationships and threat geometry that was rarely taught outside military aviation programs. Stevens found himself paying increased attention to Jessica's performance as the training evolution continued, noting details that were beginning to challenge his assumptions about civilian pilot capabilities. Her aircraft handling was becoming increasingly impressive, demonstrating skills that seemed to exceed what her paperwork indicated about her background and experience. But the discrepancy was still subtle enough that he attributed it to underestimated civilian training rather than fundamental misunderstanding about who he was flying with. The final maneuver of the initial demonstration involved a simulated gun tracking exercise, where Jessica was required to maintain proper position for weapons delivery while Stevens maneuvered defensively to test her ability to maintain targeting geometry under dynamic conditions. This exercise required three-dimensional thinking and predictive maneuvering that challenged even experienced military pilots, combining spatial awareness with tactical understanding that was developed through extensive combat training. Jessica's performance during the gun tracking exercise eliminated any remaining possibility that she represented ordinary civilian pilot competence. Her aircraft maintained perfect tracking position throughout Stevens' defensive maneuvering, demonstrating prediction skills and energy management that was consistent with advanced aerial combat training. Her technique was so precise that it appeared almost mechanical, as if she were following procedures that had been practiced thousands of times under conditions far more challenging than training exercises. As they concluded the initial demonstration and prepared to return to base, Stevens found himself fundamentally questioning his assumptions about civilian aviation capabilities and the woman flying formation beside him. Her performance had exceeded every expectation for contractor pilot competence, demonstrating skills that seemed more consistent with military training than corporate aviation experience. But her continued professional demeanor and routine radio communications maintained the impression that she considered her performance entirely normal rather than exceptional. The flight back to Shaw Air Force Base was conducted in relative silence, both pilots processing the implications of what had occurred during the training evolution. Stevens was beginning to recognize that his initial judgments might have been flawed, that the quiet woman in civilian flight gear might represent something entirely different from what he had expected. Jessica maintained her carefully constructed facade of adequate competence, showing no sign that she had demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian aviation training. As they approached the traffic pattern for landing, the stage was set for revelations that would transform the 421st Fighter Training Squadron's understanding of competence, excellence, and the quiet professionals who moved among them carrying capabilities that were invisible until the moment when they were most needed. Part 7. Escalating Mastery, the post-flight debriefing in Squadron Ready Room. Charlie began with the routine procedures that followed every training evolution, but the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that reflected Major Stevens' growing questions about what he had witnessed during the morning's flight. The standard debriefing format called for systematic review of each training objective, assessment of performance against established criteria, and identification of areas requiring additional instruction or practice. But Stevens found himself struggling to categorize Jessica's performance within the normal parameters used to evaluate civilian contractor competence. Captain Wilson and Lieutenant Cooper had gathered to observe the debriefing, their presence reflecting both routine professional interest and curiosity about how civilian aviation training compared to military standards. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined them from his position near the maintenance status board, where he had been tracking aircraft performance and noting any discrepancies that might require attention before the next scheduled flight. The assembled group represented the squadron's core leadership, and their collective experience provided a comprehensive understanding of what constituted normal performance during basic fighter training evolutions. Stevens began his assessment with the measured tone that characterized professional military debriefings, though his usual confidence was tempered by uncertainty about how to interpret what he had observed. Aircraft performance was within normal parameters, he reported, consulting his notes from the flight, while avoiding direct discussion of the pilot's capabilities that had challenged his expectations. All training objectives were completed successfully with no safety issues or procedural violations. The summary was technically accurate but incomplete, failing to capture the precision and tactical awareness that Jessica had demonstrated. Throughout the training evolution, Stevens found himself editing his observations, uncertain whether to attribute her exceptional performance to underestimated civilian training or to consider the possibility that his fundamental assumptions about her background might be incorrect. Jessica's own contribution to the debriefing maintained the carefully neutral tone that had characterized her interactions throughout the morning, providing the kind of basic feedback that civilian contractors typically offered after completing routine training requirements. "Aircraft handled well," she reported in response to Stevens' questions about her assessment of the F-16 trainer's performance. "Systems functioned normally throughout all phases of flight. No unusual characteristics or performance issues noted." Her response revealed nothing about her true assessment of the aircraft's capabilities or her comfort level with tactical maneuvering that had challenged the limits of both machine and pilot. A truly experienced combat pilot might have noted subtle differences between the trainer variant and more advanced aircraft, commented on specific systems that performed better or worse than expected, or provided tactical feedback about aircraft limitations under various flight conditions. But Jessica's feedback remained safely within the boundaries of what civilian contractors were expected to know and observe. Wilson stepped forward to examine the flight data recorder information that provided objective measurement of aircraft performance throughout the training evolution, her technical expertise allowing her to interpret the digital record of G-forces, airspeeds, and maneuvering parameters that told the story of the morning's flight. The data revealed performance characteristics that were beginning to challenge assumptions about civilian pilot capabilities, showing G-force tolerance and control precision that exceeded normal expectations for contractor training flights. Interest in energy management throughout the vertical maneuvers, Wilson observed, her comment directed toward Stevens but clearly intended for Jessica to hear and respond to. "Most civilian pilots struggle with throttle control during high-angle climbs. Your technique was quite smooth for someone without extensive military aircraft experience." Jessica's response maintained her cover story while acknowledging the observation in a way that suggested basic rather than advanced understanding of tactical flying principles. "I've had some aerobatic training," she replied, offering an explanation. That was technically accurate while being deliberately incomplete about the actual extent and nature of her background. Basic energy management is pretty similar regardless of aircraft type. The answer was carefully crafted to provide a plausible explanation for her demonstrated competence while avoiding details that might invite additional questions about where and how she had acquired skills that seemed inconsistent with civilian aviation training. Her response suggested adequate rather than exceptional understanding, maintaining the impression that her performance fell within the range of what well-trained civilian pilots might achieve through proper instruction and practice. Lieutenant Cooper reviewed the gun tracking exercise data with the enthusiasm of someone who had recently mastered these same techniques and was eager to evaluate how civilian training compared to military instruction. The recorded flight path showed tracking precision that was difficult to reconcile with limited tactical flying experience, demonstrating prediction skills and situational awareness that were normally developed through extensive combat training, rather than basic aerobatic instruction. "Your tracking geometry was remarkably consistent," Cooper observed, his comment carrying a mixture of professional respect and puzzlement about how civilian training could produce such precise results. "That kind of predictive maneuvering usually takes months of tactical flying to develop. Have you done much air-to-air work before?" Jessica's response continued to deflect attention from her true capabilities while providing explanations that maintained her cover story without revealing information that could compromise her carefully constructed civilian contractor persona. "Some formation flying," she acknowledged, offering a partial truth that explained her demonstrated competence without providing details about the advanced tactical training that had actually produced her exceptional skills. The debriefing continued with increasingly detailed discussion of specific maneuvers and performance parameters, but each exchange reinforced the growing disconnect between Jessica's apparent background and her demonstrated capabilities. Stevens found himself noting discrepancies that were becoming difficult to explain through normal civilian aviation training, while Jessica maintained responses that suggested adequate rather than exceptional competence despite evidence that clearly indicated otherwise. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez contributed observations about aircraft performance and pilot technique that reflected his extensive experience with training flights involving civilian contractors, but his comments revealed growing confusion about performance characteristics that seemed inconsistent with previous civilian pilot evaluations. Aircraft stress parameters were well within normal limits throughout all phases of flight, he reported, though his tone suggested uncertainty about implications that he was still trying to understand. The technical data showed that Jessica had operated the aircraft within design limitations while achieving performance results that pushed those limitations closer to maximum values than most civilian pilots would attempt. Her technique had maximized aircraft capability without exceeding safety margins, demonstrating understanding of aircraft performance envelopes that was more consistent with test pilot training than basic civilian instruction. As the formal debriefing concluded, the assembled squadron personnel found themselves with more questions than answers about the morning's training evolution. Jessica's performance had exceeded every expectation for civilian contractor competence, while her explanations continued to suggest basic rather than advanced flying background. The contradiction was becoming difficult to ignore, though none of them had yet considered the possibility that their fundamental assumptions about her identity might be completely wrong. Captain Wilson's final assessment captured the confusion that characterized the entire debriefing process, though she attempted to frame her observations in terms that maintained professional courtesy while acknowledging exceptional performance. "Overall, a very successful training evolution," she concluded, her words carefully chosen to avoid direct challenge to Jessica's cover story while recognizing capabilities that seemed to exceed normal civilian standards. The comment left unspoken questions about how civilian aviation training could produce such exceptional results, why someone with obviously advanced skills was working as a contractor rather than pursuing military aviation careers, and what other capabilities might be hidden beneath the surface of carefully maintained professional anonymity. As the debriefing group began to disperse, each member carried with them growing awareness that the morning's training evolution had revealed something unexpected about civilian aviation capabilities and the quiet professionals who moved among them, carrying skills that were invisible until the moment when they were demonstrated under conditions that revealed their true extent. The stage was set for additional revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about competence, excellence, and the careful boundaries between civilian and military aviation expertise. Part 8. Recognition Trigger: The Arrival of Brigadier General Patricia Hayes at Shaw Air Force Base was announced by the distinctive sound of a military staff car pulling through the main gate, its government plates and official markings commanding the immediate attention of security personnel who snapped to attention with the precision that marked routine interaction with senior leadership. The general's visit had been scheduled weeks in advance as part of routine inspections that kept higher headquarters informed about training standards and operational readiness throughout the command structure, but her timing would prove to be anything but routine for the 421st Fighter Training Squadron. General Hayes emerged from the staff car with the confident bearing that marked 30 years of military aviation experience, her uniform displaying the ribbons and decorations that told the story of a career spent mastering every aspect of military flying, from basic instruction through advanced combat operations. Her silver hair was regulation length, but showed the kind of practical styling that suggested someone who had spent more time in cockpits than conference rooms, and her movement across the tarmac carried the unconscious grace that came from decades of adapting to various aircraft and operational environments. At 55, General Hayes represented the pinnacle of military aviation leadership, combining operational experience with administrative responsibility in ways that commanded respect from both aircrew and support personnel. Her background included combat tours in multiple theaters, test pilot experience with experimental aircraft programs, and command positions that had given her oversight of some of the military's most advanced aviation training programs. She was exactly the kind of senior leader who noticed details that escaped routine observation and who understood the difference between surface competence and genuine expertise. Her aide, Major Christina Park, accompanied her with the kind of professional efficiency that characterized staff officers who had learned to anticipate their commander's requirements while managing the complex logistics that made senior leadership visits possible. Park carried a tablet containing the day's schedule and inspection criteria, but she also maintained the situational awareness that allowed her to identify and address issues before they required the general's direct attention. The general's inspection began with routine visits to maintenance facilities and administrative offices, standard procedures that verified compliance with regulations and assessed overall unit effectiveness according to established criteria. But her real interest lay in observing actual training operations, where the difference between nominal competence and genuine excellence became apparent through direct observation of pilots and aircraft operating under realistic conditions. As General Hayes approached Hangar Delta-7, her attention was immediately drawn to the unusual activity surrounding the post-flight debriefing that was concluding in CO's Squadron Ready Room Charlie. The assembled group of pilots and ground crew suggested something more significant than routine training evolution, and her experienced eye noted subtle signs of tension and confusion that marked situations where expected outcomes had not materialized according to plan. Major Stevens noticed the general's approach and immediately transitioned into the formal military courtesy that marked interactions between operational units and senior leadership, calling the assembled personnel to attention, while preparing to provide the kind of briefing that kept higher headquarters informed about training activities and unit performance. But Stevens found himself uncertain about how to characterize the morning's training evolution in terms that accurately reflected what had occurred without revealing his own confusion about civilian contractor capabilities. General Hayes Stevens began with the professional confidence that had marked his interactions with senior leadership throughout his career. "We've just completed a basic fighter maneuver training evolution with a civilian Contractor completing recertification requirements. All training objectives were met with no safety issues or procedural violations. The summary was technically accurate, but deliberately incomplete, avoiding discussion of performance characteristics that had challenged Stevens' assumptions about civilian aviation capabilities. His briefing maintained the kind of neutral tone that characterized routine training reports, while carefully avoiding specifics that might require explanations he wasn't prepared to provide. General Hayes acknowledged the briefing with the kind of professional interest that senior leaders showed toward routine training activities, but her attention was simultaneously drawn to the woman in civilian flight gear who stood quietly beside the maintenance status board. Something about Jessica's posture and bearing triggered recognition patterns that had been developed through decades of experience with military personnel operating under various cover stories and operational requirements. The general's initial observation noted details that escaped casual attention. The way Jessica automatically maintained situational awareness while appearing to focus on routine post-flight procedures, the unconscious positioning that kept her back protected and options open, and the subtle efficiency of movement that suggested training that extended far beyond civilian aviation requirements. These details were individually insignificant, but collectively suggested someone whose background included experience that wasn't reflected in standard civilian contractor documentation. Most significantly, General Hayes noticed the small silver pin that Jessica wore beneath her civilian contractor badge, a piece of jewelry that would appear unremarkable to most observers, but which carried specific meaning for senior leaders who had been briefed on classified programs and operational activities that existed outside normal military channels. The pin's design included elements that were recognizable only to individuals with appropriate clearance levels and need-to-know access to information about programs that officially didn't exist. The recognition was immediate and profound, triggering memory patterns that connected the quiet woman in civilian flight gear with operational reports and classified briefings that had described capabilities and achievements that belonged in legends rather than official records. General Hayes found herself looking at someone whose presence at Shaw Air Force Base raised questions about operational security, cover story maintenance, and the reasons why someone with obviously classified background would be conducting routine training with unsuspecting military personnel. Jessica became aware of the general's attention through the kind of peripheral awareness that had been developed through years of operating in environments where survival depended on recognizing threats and opportunities before they became critical. She noted the general's focused observation and recognized the signs of someone who possessed information that could compromise carefully maintained operational security. The moment of mutual recognition was subtle enough that the assembled squadron personnel noticed nothing unusual, but it carried implications that would transform the entire dynamic of the morning's training evolution. General Hayes understood that she was looking at someone whose true identity was protected by classification levels that extended far beyond routine military training operations, while Jessica recognized that her carefully constructed cover story was about to be challenged by someone with authority and knowledge that could expose her real background. The general's response was measured and professional, designed to maintain operational security while acknowledging the situation that had developed through coincidental timing and circumstances that neither party had anticipated. "Major Stevens," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present, "I'd like to review the morning's training activities in more detail. Perhaps we could discuss the specific maneuvers and performance characteristics that were demonstrated." The request was phrased as routine professional interest, but Stevens detected undertones that suggested the general's curiosity extended beyond normal training oversight. Her attention seemed focused on the civilian contractor rather than squadron performance, though her questions were carefully structured to avoid direct challenge to established cover stories or operational procedures. Jessica maintained her civilian contractor persona, while recognizing that the situation was evolving in ways that could require acknowledgement of her true identity and background. Her response remained professionally neutral, but she prepared for the possibility that operational security considerations might require coordination with senior leadership to prevent compromise of classified programs and personnel. The stage was set for revelations that would transform everyone's understanding of the morning's training evolution, delivered by someone with authority and knowledge that could validate capabilities that had been hidden beneath carefully maintained cover. Stories and operational anonymity. Part 9. Identity Unveiling. General Hayes stepped forward with the measured authority that characterized 30 years of military leadership, her presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the squadron-ready room. The casual atmosphere that had marked the post-flight debriefing evaporated instantly, replaced by the focused professionalism that marked interactions between operational units and senior command authority. Major Stevens straightened reflexively, his squadron following suit as military courtesy protocols, engaged automatically in response to the general's obvious intent to address the assembled group. At ease, General Hayes commanded, her voice carrying the kind of practiced authority that put subordinates at their proper level of attention without creating unnecessary tension. She moved deliberately toward Jessica Martinez, who maintained her civilian contractor posture while internally preparing for whatever revelation was about to unfold. The general's approach was neither threatening nor casual, but rather carried the weight of someone who possessed information that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the situation they thought they were managing. Ms. Martinez, the general began, using Jessica's civilian name while allowing a slight pause that suggested she possessed additional information about identity and background that wasn't reflected in standard contractor documentation. Or perhaps, I should say, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, though I suspect that rank designation doesn't adequately reflect your actual service record or current status within programs that most of these fine people have never heard of. The words fell into the ready room silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion and shock that spread through the assembled squadron personnel as they attempted to process information that challenged every assumption they had made about the quiet woman in civilian flight gear. Major Stevens felt his professional confidence waver as he realized that his judgment about civilian contractor capabilities had been fundamentally flawed in ways that extended far beyond simple underestimation of flying competence. Jessica's response was carefully measured, acknowledging the general's recognition while maintaining operational security, protocols, that protected classified information and personnel identities that existed outside normal military channels. General Hayes, she replied, her voice carrying subtle changes in tone and bearing that suggested the dropping of carefully maintained facades and the acknowledgement of authority relationships that had been hidden beneath civilian contractor cover stories. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hayes announced, turning to address the squadron personnel, who were struggling to reconcile their observations with revelations that challenged their fundamental understanding of military aviation hierarchy and operational structure. You have been conducting training operations with one of the military's most classified assets, someone whose true background and capabilities are protected by security classifications that extend well beyond normal training program requirements. The general's words carried the weight of authority that brooked no argument or casual dismissal, though they also created more questions than they answered about identity, background, and the reasons why someone with obviously advanced military credentials would be operating under civilian contractor cover. Major Stevens found himself mentally reviewing the morning's training evolution with growing awareness that his assessment criteria had been completely inadequate for evaluating someone whose true capabilities extended far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Captain Wilson stepped forward with the kind of professional curiosity that marked Experienced military aviators encountering situations that challenge their understanding of operational structure and personnel classification. General. With respect, her paperwork indicates civilian contractor status with basic commercial aviation background. How do we reconcile that with what you're telling us about military service and classified operations? General Hayes nodded approvingly at Wilson's question, recognizing the kind of logical thinking that made effective military officers while understanding the confusion that resulted from encountering operational security measures that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of recognition and exposure. Captain Wilson, the paperwork you've seen represents cover documentation designed to allow operational personnel to maintain civilian identities while completing routine training and certification requirements. The actual service record is classified at levels that require need-to-know access and special security clearances. The explanation provided context without revealing specific information about programs, operations, or capabilities that remained protected by classification requirements that extended beyond the clearance levels possessed by normal training squadron personnel. General Hayes maintained the careful balance between acknowledgement and protection that characterized senior leadership dealing with classified personnel operating under operational security constraints. Lieutenant Cooper spoke up with the kind of direct question that reflected his youth and relative inexperience with complex operational security requirements, though his inquiry also demonstrated the logical thinking that had earned him assignment to an elite training squadron. Ma'am, if Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has advanced military qualifications, why was she assigned to basic fighter training rather than advanced tactical exercises that would better match her actual capabilities? Jessica answered before General Hayes could respond, her voice carrying the professional competence that had been hidden beneath civilian contractor anonymity, while maintaining the kind of measured explanation that protected operational details from unnecessary exposure. Routine proficiency requirements, Lieutenant. Even personnel with advanced qualifications need periodic demonstration of basic competencies to maintain certification for various operational assignments. Basic fighter maneuvers provide adequate assessment of fundamental flying skills without requiring complex training scenarios or specialized aircraft. The explanation was technically accurate, while being deliberately incomplete about the actual reasons why someone with her background might need to maintain various types of flying certification and operational readiness. Her response suggested routine administrative requirements rather than the complex operational considerations that actually governed her training and certification schedule. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found his voice despite the confusion that marked his attempt to reconcile maintenance observations with revelations about pilot qualifications and background that extended far beyond anything he had previously encountered. General, the aircraft performance data from this morning's flight showed parameters that were unusual for civilian contractor training. Should we have been monitoring different criteria or applying different safety standards? General Hayes smiled with the kind of professional amusement that marked senior leaders dealing with subordinates who were asking intelligent questions while struggling to understand situations that extended beyond their normal experience and training. Sergeant Rodriguez, your aircraft monitoring was entirely appropriate and professional. The performance parameters you observed simply reflected pilot capabilities that exceeded your normal expectations for civilian contractor competence. No procedural changes were required because safety standards remain constant regardless of pilot background or classification status. The General's response reassured the ground crew chief while acknowledging that his technical observations had been accurate and that the unusual performance characteristics he had noted reflected genuine pilot capability, rather than procedural violations or safety issues that required corrective action. Major Stevens struggled to formulate questions that would help him understand the operational and administrative implications of discovering that his squadron had been conducting training with someone whose true qualifications and background extended far beyond anything indicated by routine documentation and briefing materials. General Hayes, are there specific protocols we should have followed when dealing with classified personnel operating under civilian cover? Did we miss requirements or procedures that should have been implemented? The question reflected Stevens' professional concern about proper procedures and his desire to ensure that his squadron had met all requirements, despite operating without complete information about pilot background and qualifications. His inquiry also demonstrated the kind of responsible leadership that sought to learn from unusual situations rather than simply accepting confusion as unavoidable. General Hayes addressed Stevens' concerns with the kind of authoritative guidance that senior leaders provided to operational units dealing with complex situations that extended beyond normal training scenarios. Major Stevens, your squadron's performance was entirely professional and appropriate given the information available to you. Personnel operating under operational security cover are specifically trained to blend into normal training environments without requiring special procedures or additional security measures. Your standard protocols were sufficient for the situation. The reassurance provided Stevens with confirmation that his squadron had operated properly, while acknowledging that the morning's training evolution had involved complexities that extended beyond normal contractor training requirements. The General's guidance also established that future similar situations would be handled according to existing procedures, rather than requiring development of new protocols or special security measures. As the initial shock of revelation began to settle, the assembled squadron personnel found themselves processing information that fundamentally altered their understanding of competence, classification, and the quiet professionals who moved among them, carrying capabilities that were invisible until circumstances required their acknowledgement by appropriate authority. General Hayes moved to the squadron's tactical display board, where training scenarios and aircraft performance charts provided the visual framework for understanding complex aviation operations under various conditions. Her presence commanded absolute attention from every person in the ready room as she prepared to provide context that would transform their understanding of the quiet woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about civilian contractor competence and military aviation excellence. Operation Silent Thunder, the General began, her voice carrying the weight of classified briefings and operational histories that existed in the shadowy realm between official military records and legends that were whispered among professionals who had earned the right to know such stories. Most of you have never heard that designation, and until today, you never should have. It represents 8 years of the most challenging deep penetration reconnaissance missions ever attempted by military aviation, conducted using aircraft that officially don't exist and techniques that pushed both technology and human capability beyond previously accepted limitations. The General's words created a silence so profound that the ambient sounds of base operations seemed to fade into insignificance, leaving only the quiet hum of air conditioning systems and the distant rumble of aircraft operations that continued outside the ready room walls. Major Stevens found himself leaning forward unconsciously, his professional curiosity overriding the shock of discovery as he began to understand that the morning's training evolution had involved someone whose background included experiences that belonged in the realm of tactical aviation legend rather than routine contractor training. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, General Hayes continued, using Jessica's military rank and surname with the kind of formal recognition that acknowledged service and sacrifice that extended far beyond normal military aviation careers, was the primary pilot for missions that required infiltrating airspace that was considered impossible to penetrate using conventional aircraft and tactics. Her operational area covered regions where surface-to-air missile systems created overlapping coverage that should have made aircraft survival impossible, where enemy radar networks provided detection capabilities that could track conventional military aircraft from hundreds of miles away. Jessica stood quietly beside the maintenance status board, her civilian contractor facade now completely abandoned as the general's briefing revealed operational details that had been classified at the highest levels for reasons that extended beyond normal military security requirements. Her expression showed neither pride nor discomfort at the recognition, but rather the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to carry extraordinary achievements without seeking acknowledgement or validation from people who couldn't understand the costs that such operations demanded. The aircraft she flew were modified F-117X prototypes, General Hayes explained, providing technical details that would help the assembled aviation professionals understand the complexity and danger of the missions being described. Experimental stealth technology combined with navigation systems that operated independently of satellite networks that could be compromised or jammed by enemy forces. These were aircraft that required manual flying skills and navigation techniques that hadn't been used since before GPS became standard military equipment. Captain Wilson interrupted with the kind of technical question that reflected her background in advanced aviation systems and her growing comprehension of the operational challenges that such missions would have presented to even the most skilled pilots. General, manual navigation over hostile territory would require landmark recognition and dead reckoning techniques that most modern pilots never develop. How does someone acquire those kinds of skills without extensive specialized training that would appear in official records? The question demonstrated Wilson's professional understanding of navigation challenges, while revealing her confusion about how someone could develop such capabilities without leaving traces in standard military training documentation. Her inquiry also reflected the growing awareness that Jessica's background included experiences that extended far beyond what conventional military aviation training could provide. "Captain Wilson," Jessica responded before General Hayes could answer, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned navigation techniques through necessity rather than classroom instruction. When satellite navigation is compromised by enemy jamming and standard RADIO beacons become targeting references for surface-to-air missiles, you learn alternative methods through operational requirement rather than formal training programs. Most of those techniques were developed during missions rather than in training environments. Her answer provided insight into the improvisational nature of operations that occurred outside normal military structure and support systems, where pilots learned to solve problems through immediate necessity rather than following established procedures that might not apply to unique operational requirements. The explanation also suggested that her capabilities had been developed through direct experience with challenges that most military pilots never encountered during normal service careers. Lieutenant Cooper spoke up with the kind of direct question that reflected his recent tactical training and his attempt to understand operational concepts that extended beyond his current experience and knowledge. "Ma'am, how do you conduct reconnaissance missions in heavily defended airspace without fighter escort or electronic warfare support? Those kinds of operations normally require extensive mission planning and multiple aircraft working in coordination." Jessica's response revealed the isolation and self-reliance that had characterized operations conducted outside normal military support structures, where individual pilots were required to complete missions using only their personal skills and single aircraft capabilities. "Lieutenant Cooper, deep penetration reconnaissance requires stealth rather than force protection. Fighter escorts create radar signatures that compromise stealth operations. Electronic warfare support generates emissions that reveal operational intent to enemy intelligence systems. Solo operations minimize detection probability while maximizing mission flexibility and operational security." The explanation demonstrated tactical thinking that prioritized mission success over conventional force protection doctrine, revealing operational philosophy that accepted individual risk in exchange for mission capabilities that couldn't be achieved through normal military procedures. Her response also suggested comfort with isolation and self-reliance that was developed through repeated exposure to operations where survival depended entirely on personal competence and decision-making ability. General Hayes resumed her briefing with details that provided context for understanding the strategic importance of missions that had been conducted outside normal military channels and operational oversight. The intelligence gathered during Operation Silent Thunder prevented 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil and provided early warning about weapons proliferation that allowed diplomatic intervention before military action became necessary. The strategic value of these missions extended far beyond normal tactical aviation contributions to national security. The general's summary provided perspective on operational significance that helped the assembled squadron personnel understand why such missions justified the risks and resources that had been dedicated to capabilities that existed outside normal military structure. Her briefing also established that Jessica's service had produced measurable benefits that extended far beyond personal achievement or professional recognition. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez asked the kind of practical question that reflected his responsibility for aircraft maintenance and his growing understanding of the technical challenges that such operations would have presented to both pilots and support personnel. General Hayes, how do you maintain aircraft that don't officially exist? Modified prototypes would require specialized parts and maintenance procedures that aren't covered in standard technical manuals. The question demonstrated Rodriguez's professional curiosity about logistical challenges, while revealing his comprehension of the complex support requirements that would have been necessary to sustain operations using experimental aircraft and unconventional procedures. His inquiry also reflected growing awareness of the extensive infrastructure that must have been required to support missions that officially never occurred. Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hayes replied, "That's an excellent question that highlights one of the most challenging aspects of classified operations. Maintenance was performed by specially cleared personnel using procedures that were developed specifically for these aircraft. Parts were manufactured through channels that maintained operational security while ensuring technical reliability. The logistics were complex, but they were manageable because the operational requirements justified whatever resources were necessary." The general's answer provided insight into the extensive support infrastructure that had been required to sustain operations that existed outside normal military channels, while acknowledging the complexity of maintaining operational security, while ensuring technical reliability and safety standards that were appropriate for high-risk missions. Major Stevens formulated a question that reflected his command responsibility and his need to understand how such operations fit within normal military hierarchy and operational oversight structures. "General, how do classified operations coordinate with normal military activities to prevent conflicts or compromised operational security? How do you manage personnel who operate outside normal command channels?" The question demonstrated Stevens' professional concern about command and control issues while revealing his growing comprehension of the complex coordination that would have been required to manage operations that existed outside normal military structure and oversight procedures. "Major Stevens," General Hayes responded, "classified operations require coordination at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Personnel assignments and operational scheduling are managed through secure channels that maintain operational security, while ensuring that classified activities don't conflict with normal military operations. The coordination is complex, but it's necessary to maintain both operational effectiveness and security requirements." Her answer provided general guidance about classified operation management while avoiding specific details, about coordination procedures and oversight mechanisms that remained protected by security classifications that extended beyond the clearance levels possessed by normal training squadron personnel. As the briefing continued, the assembled squadron personnel found themselves gaining appreciation for operational complexity and personal sacrifice that extended far beyond anything they had previously encountered in their military aviation careers. Delivered by someone whose quiet competence had concealed capabilities that belonged in the realm of legend rather than routine training evolution. Part 11. Personal Cost and Humanity, the Tactical Display Board in Squadron. Ready Room Charlie seemed to fade into insignificance as General Hayes prepared to address the human cost of operations that had demanded capabilities extending far beyond normal military aviation requirements. The assembled squadron personnel had begun to understand the technical complexity and strategic importance of Jessica's background, but they were about to learn about sacrifices that couldn't be measured in terms of mission success or operational achievement. The general's expression shifted subtly, taking on the somber tone that marked discussions of losses that were never recorded in official casualty reports or memorial services. Operation Desert Phantom, General Hayes began, using a designation that carried weight and meaning that extended beyond mere operational nomenclature into the realm of personal tragedy and sacrifice that defined the true cost of excellence in military aviation. The final mission of Operation Silent Thunder, conducted under conditions that pushed both technology and human endurance beyond previously tested limitations. Intelligence indicated that terrorist organizations had acquired advanced surface-to-air missile systems that threatened civilian aircraft operations throughout the region, requiring immediate reconnaissance to prevent potential catastrophic attacks. Jessica's posture shifted almost imperceptibly as the general's briefing approached topics that remained emotionally difficult despite the passage of years that had provided distance from events that had fundamentally altered her life and career trajectory. Her expression maintained professional composure, but subtle changes in breathing and muscle tension revealed the kind of psychological preparation that preceded discussions of experiences that were never fully processed or resolved through normal therapeutic channels. The mission required 2 aircraft operating in coordination to provide comprehensive intelligence coverage while maintaining stealth characteristics that would prevent detection by enemy radar systems that had been specifically configured to counter American military aviation capabilities. General Hayes continued, her voice carrying the careful precision that marked briefings dealing with classified operations that had resulted in personnel losses that couldn't be acknowledged through normal military recognition procedures. Major Stevens found himself paying increased attention to details that would help him understand operational complexity while simultaneously watching Jessica's reactions to revelations about experiences that had obviously carried personal costs, extending beyond professional challenges. His professional experience with tactical aviation provided context for understanding mission difficulty, while his leadership background helped him recognize signs of emotional strain that suggested unresolved grief and survivor guilt that characterized military personnel who had lost colleagues during high-risk operations. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez flew the primary reconnaissance aircraft, the general explained, providing operational context that established Jessica's role and responsibility during missions that had demanded capabilities that few pilots possessed, and even fewer could execute successfully under combat conditions. Her wingman, Major Sarah Thompson, Calcine Echo, operated the secondary platform that provided communications, relay and backup intelligence gathering capability in case the primary aircraft was compromised or destroyed by enemy action. The mention of Major Thompson's name in Calcine created a visible reaction in Jessica that was impossible to disguise despite her professional training and years of practice at maintaining emotional control during difficult conversations. Her jaw tightened slightly, Her breathing became more controlled, and her eyes fixed on a point beyond the ready room walls, as she mentally prepared to relive experiences that remained psychologically challenging despite the passage of time and extensive efforts to process trauma through appropriate channels. Captain Wilson recognized the signs of someone dealing with combat loss and spoke with the kind of gentle professionalism that military aviators used when discussing colleagues who had been lost during operational activities. General Hayes, was Major Thompson lost during the mission? How do you handle casualty notification and family support when operations are classified at levels that prevent normal recognition and memorial procedures? The question demonstrated Wilson's understanding of military aviation culture and her awareness of the importance of proper recognition for personnel who had made ultimate sacrifices during service to their country. Her inquiry also revealed comprehension of the complex emotional challenges that resulted from losses that couldn't be acknowledged through normal military memorial traditions and family support systems. Jessica answered before General Hayes could respond, her voice carrying the kind of controlled emotion that marked someone who had learned to discuss traumatic experiences while maintaining professional composure, despite ongoing psychological difficulty with events that had fundamentally altered her understanding of sacrifice and survival. Major Thompson was the finest pilot I ever flew with, she said, her words carefully measured to acknowledge professional excellence while avoiding details that remained emotionally difficult to discuss in public settings. Sarah had capabilities that exceeded mine in several critical areas, Jessica continued, providing professional assessment that honored her wingman's memory while revealing the personal loss that had accompanied operational failure despite successful mission completion. Her tactical awareness was superior to anyone I encountered during 8 years of classified operations. Her technical flying skills were flawless under conditions that challenged the limits of human and mechanical capability. She was someone who made everyone around her better at their profession, simply through example and shared expertise. The eulogy was delivered with the kind of professional restraint that characterized military personnel discussing fallen colleagues, but undertones of personal grief and unresolved guilt were evident to anyone familiar with combat loss and survivor psychology. Jessica's description revealed not just professional respect, but personal affection and ongoing struggle with questions about alternative decisions that might have produced different outcomes. Lieutenant Cooper asked the kind of direct question that reflected his limited experience with combat loss while demonstrating genuine concern for understanding operational realities that extended beyond training scenarios and simulated emergencies. "Ma'am, what happened during the mission? How do you lose an experienced pilot during reconnaissance operations that are planned to avoid direct combat engagement?" Jessica's response revealed operational details that provided context for understanding how even the most carefully planned missions could encounter unexpected challenges that demanded split-second decisions with consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. "Intelligence was incomplete about enemy capabilities," she explained, her voice maintaining professional tone while revealing underlying anger about inadequate support that had contributed to operational failure and personal loss. "Surface-to-air missile systems were more advanced than briefing materials indicated," she continued, providing technical explanation that helped the assembled aviators understand how operational conditions had differed from planned scenarios in ways that created lethal challenges for aircraft and pilots operating under stealth requirements that limited defensive options and escape routes. "The extraction route came under fire sooner than anticipated," Jessica explained, her narrative becoming more detailed as she described tactical situations that had required immediate decision-making under conditions where conventional military procedures were inadequate for addressing unique operational challenges. Enemy forces had established overlapping coverage that made normal egress impossible without compromising stealth characteristics that were essential for mission completion and strategic operational security. General Hayes provided additional context that helped explain command decisions and tactical considerations that had created impossible choices between mission completion and personnel safety. Intelligence value of the reconnaissance data was critical for preventing terrorist attacks that could have resulted in hundreds of civilian casualties, she explained, providing strategic perspective that established why mission completion had been prioritized despite obvious risks to flight crews and aircraft. Someone had to maintain position to provide communication relay and defensive coverage while the primary aircraft completed intelligence gathering and began extraction procedures. Jessica continued, her voice carrying the weight of command. Decisions that had resulted in personal loss despite successful mission completion. Sarah volunteered to provide rearguard action that would ensure mission success, while accepting personal risk that we both understood was likely to be fatal. The description revealed tactical decisions that had been made under extreme time pressure by highly trained professionals who understood the strategic importance of their mission, while accepting personal consequences that extended beyond normal military service requirements. Jessica's narrative provided insight into command relationships and tactical coordination that had functioned perfectly, despite resulting in personnel loss that remained emotionally difficult to accept. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spoke with the kind of practical concern that characterized ground crew personnel who understood aircraft limitations and pilot capabilities, while recognizing the importance of technical support for mission success and personnel survival. Ma'am, were there equipment limitations or mechanical failures that contributed to the tactical situation? Could different aircraft or systems have provided better defensive capability or escape options? Jessica's answer revealed the extent to which operational success had depended on human capability rather than technological solutions, while acknowledging that even the most advanced military systems had limitations that required personal sacrifice to overcome during critical situations. Equipment functioned perfectly within design parameters, she replied, providing technical assessment that established aircraft and systems reliability while acknowledging that tactical situations had exceeded technological solutions. The limitation was time and geography rather than mechanical capability, she continued, explaining how operational constraints had created tactical challenges that required human decision-making and personal sacrifice rather than technological solutions that could address strategic requirements within acceptable risk parameters. As Jessica's narrative continued, the assembled squadron personnel began to understand that extraordinary capability often came with personal costs that extended far beyond professional recognition or career advancement, and that the quiet professionals who moved among them, carrying exceptional skills, often bore psychological burdens that were invisible until circumstances required acknowledgement of experiences that had shaped their understanding of service, sacrifice, and survival. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.